Good afternoon. My name is Sara Nelson. I am the president of the Association of Flight Attendants-CWA, and I do think that it's important. First of all, it's an honor to speak after Sherrod. He's been very clear with me that he will never speak after me again. But he's set the scene perfectly. But I do think it's important to also set the scene from the perspective that I'm going to bring to you, because I never ever imagined that I would be in a room like this. My brother definitely wanted to go into politics, and he spent time when we were growing up at Boys State, and they would sit around and talk about how none of them were ever going to inhale because that might be a problem, and and wholly focused on also going to UVA Law School because he wanted the Kennedy tradition. And I didn't think that I had any interest in any of that. I just wanted to have a really good time. And so I was going to be a high school English teacher. And as I was planning to set up my classroom and staring down student debts and trying to think about how I was going to make it on a first-year teacher's salary, a friend of mine who had become a flight attendant called me. And she called me on a very snowy day in St. Louis where I was. And she called me with her feet in the sand in Miami Beach, first giving me a hard time about that, and then going on to say, this job is actually no joke. And she explained the contract that had been negotiated since 1946, when the first flight attendants organized at United Airlines first, and built it up at that point over close to 60 years of bargaining. And it was going to be higher pay than my first year as a teacher. There would be more flexibility. There was going to be health care that was actually good for women because it was negotiated by women. And there would be a pension that I could take at age 50. And so working 4 jobs at 23 and trying to figure out how I was going to get by, I hightailed it to Chicago the next day and interviewed with United Airlines and became a flight attendant. And immediately out of training, the company failed to pay me. I found out what it was like to be a number in an HR file, and it wasn't until a fellow union member tapped me on the shoulder, offered me an $800 check and said, number 1, you go take care of yourself, and number 2, you call our union. And so I got involved, and 5 years later, September 11th happened. And we're 80% organized in the airline industry. So we have, as you can see on the chart here, and actually, could we have the other chart up about union density first? So as you'll see on the chart, in 1979, the airline industry deregulated, and you can see that on here. And you can see also from about 57 to 1980, that is the result of Taft-Hartley, starting to take away the rights of union members and pushing right to work in different states, so declining that union membership. But when I started flying, it was on the backs of Ronald Reagan firing the air traffic controllers in 1981 and making it very clear that it was open season on unions. And so you can see the line just drops straight down from there. As the strike was made a dirty word, there was already the chamber and the business community were all attacking unions, but now you had it coming from the President of the United States. At the same time that our financial system was overhauled, and we allowed things like stock buybacks and allowed tax cuts to the top 10%, while we're leaving the rest of everyone behind, and more there's less of a check in corporate greed. So this was already starting to happen in a lot of other industries, but on September 11th, 2001, I was a 5-year flight attendant flying out of Boston. And everything changed that day. Flight 175 that you can picture flying into the South Tower of the World Trade Center, and you can picture it because all cameras were trained on that site because American Flight 11 had hit the North Tower 17 minutes earlier. On Flight 175 that I had flown the week before and flew very often were my good friends. There were Amy and Michael and another Amy, Robert, Al, Alicia, Catherine, Marianne and Jesus, and I say their names almost every single day. We lost them that day. We were trying to work through our grief. We were dealing with immediate furloughs that meant in Boston, half of the base was furloughed immediately because we were quite junior. Many of the people were roommates with the people who had died. And we were trying to pick up the pieces. And what we didn't know was that there were crisis capitalists planning from that very moment to take advantage of this moment, to change the value, the market rate of a flight attendant, a pilot, a mechanic, a gate agent, to outsource the sky caps and the kitchens so that they could have these jobs with no benefits at all and at the lowest wages. And so I saw that upfront and personal and was very involved during the 38-month-long bankruptcy at United Airlines, but there were bankruptcies across the industry to do this. And as pay was cut, people agreed to work longer days. So you can see right away, as union density was declining here, income inequality goes up at almost the exact same rate. If we move over to the productivity chart, as people were making less money, there were fewer jobs available, people were willing to work for less because they still had to pay their rent, their mortgage. They still had to take care of their families. They had to try to make it work. And the 8-hour day that we negotiated in our first flight attendant contract in 1946, that was on the backs of a fighting labor movement, fighting for that 8-hour day, was stripped away in that bankruptcy in the early 2000s. And that happened across the board. So as I was attending over the last 20 years political events, and I would hear Democrats say, unions, the people who brought you the weekend and the 8-hour day, and they would go on to list all the things that union members and the working class have lost, actually, over the past 40 years with this assault on unions. Most people don't know what an 8-hour day looks like today. Most people don't have a weekend. Most people are working 2 and 3 jobs to try to get by. And in this case, the flight attendants and other airline workers agreed to get rid of some of those great work rules that made me drive to Chicago. And then they came for our pensions. And they came for our pensions in 2005, just on the heels of President Bush failing to privatize Social Security. And so it was open season on defined benefit pension plans then. I remember at the beginning of the bankruptcy talking about what could potentially happen. And the pilots said, oh, they're never going to come for the pensions because pensions are a sacred cow in this country. And all they had to do was work on dividing workers from each other, making workers feel like they're in competition with each other. If you have a pension, that's not fair. I don't have a pension, you shouldn't have one either. As opposed to the idea that an injury to one is an injury to all, and we should be lifting each other. A friend of mine talks about the metaphor of a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, those boats are turning more and more into yachts. And as we think about this in the kind of world that we need to build and the kind of solidarity that you need to have in democracy, we shouldn't be thinking of ourselves as the boats. We should be thinking of ourselves as the tide. And that tide can turn over yachts too. Just saying. So there's the 4 Ds of union busting: divide, delay, distract, and demoralize. And this has been the program that has depleted union membership, has kept people believing that they're in competition with each other. And since the beginning of time, the biggest tools of the boss for dividing and distracting and delaying any results and demoralizing is racism and sexism. When I think about my union that was built up by women, I know that we had to fight through incredible discriminatory practices to turn this job into a career. You didn't used to be able to be married or have children. We had to step on a weight scale until 1993. And when I interviewed a flight attendant who had started in the 1940s, and she was one of our first union representatives, and she actually went all over the world and was successful in getting the evacuation signal as standard equipment on all aircraft everywhere. She's quite a go-getter. But she said to me, Sarah, you know, I am personally opposed to abortion. But she said, one of the things that I had to do most often as a union representative was help women try to get a safe abortion, because they were going to lose their freedom and their ability to have any say in what this world looks like, have any autonomy at all, because they had been raped on a layover, or they had had a boyfriend and gotten pregnant. And they were going to have to go back home to where they were already in an abusive situation, where people just wanted them to be baby makers and homemakers. And so it's very important that we take in the fact that social justice is directly tied to economic justice. So as this productivity has increased at almost the exact rate that the inequality has increased in this country and union membership has gone down, wages have remained relatively stagnant. And if you know, now they're trying to divide us by political ideology. They've always tried to divide us by class too. And there's a lot of, why do workers vote against their own self-interest? Well, if you look at this chart, have workers been voting against their own self-interest? Not a single election got better for them. Every single one got worse. It's really important to take that in. It's really important to take in the fact that we need very simple solutions. After going through the crisis of the bankruptcy and somehow haphazardly becoming president of our union, strong sense of justice and a loud mouth will carry you very far, by the way. I had to figure out how we were going to build back. We are in a round of bargaining right now that is the first round of bargaining since 9/11 where we actually have the opportunity to address the issues in the workplace today that people care about and try to make headway 20 years later. So when we hit the crisis of COVID, we were not about to allow this crisis to be used against us again. We had learned that lesson. And as I had been out too, working with other workers, I understood more and more that I couldn't be the president of the flight attendant union without standing up for other workers, without understanding their issues. I remember standing out on the GM picket line in 2019 and hearing some of the same complaints that I heard from flight attendants the day before in a flight attendant union meeting. They might have been called something slightly different, but there were tiers of employment where some workers are defined as more valuable than others and make a different set of pay and benefits. And there were people who were being forced to work overtime. There were people who had no control over their schedules. There were people who had lost their pensions. They had lost any ability to have that retirement security. And during the same time, there's been an attack on our federal programs too. It's about breaking everything and making sure that it doesn't work. So it's been about trying to break the post office, and so that people can't count on the delivery of mail. And so we should just privatize it, because privatizing will solve everything. During the 2019 government shutdown, this became very apparent to me, as there was no political solution in sight, and the shutdown had gone on twice as long as any other government shutdown. And supposedly it was about a southern border wall and the racist fear-mongering that was going on along with that. That was the demand for opening the government again from the White House. And really, that was a distraction. That was another union-busting tactic. What we saw was, this is about making government not work. This is about breaking federal workers. This is about pushing air traffic controllers to the brink so that they have to walk off the job. And so that there would be an argument to privatize everything. If there were an aircraft accident, power would accrue to the executive. If there was a terrorist event, power would accrue to the executive. And if nothing happened at all, they would say, see, we were right. It's just a big bureaucracy that we don't need. And so as I look at Project 2025, I just see a sped up version of what there has been attempted to be done over the last 50 years. To break everything, make it not work, never invest in the people, and continue to give tax breaks to the rich. So much so that then they're controlling our politics too. And we try to do little, simple, little tiny changes to these policies to try to make a difference for people, as opposed to being very bold and very clear about what needs to be done. During COVID, we said this is never going to happen again. So we needed simple solutions. And so we put forward a plan that was workers first. We said that the government should provide grants to the airlines that are a complete pass-through to workers. It continues to our paychecks, and the government doesn't have to become the HR solution for all the people who are out of work. It kept us connected to our healthcare, kept us getting contributions to our retirement, and it kept us paying state and local taxes that actually need to be there in order to support our public programs. And so we had hoped that this would be a program that would be used across the rest of the economy, but it wasn't. And the one thing that the airlines fought against, we actually negotiated outside of the political process to get them on the same page. The one thing they would not agree to was not using any federal dollars to union bust. They agreed to cap their pay. They agreed to ban stock buybacks. They would not agree to not spending any money on union busting, okay? Because they want to continue to keep that control. So this is the one check on corporate greed that we still have in this economy, and it is critically important that if we want to save this democracy, we have to give people the agency to have a union, to negotiate, to practice democracy in their workplace. This is the one place where they get to practice that. It's the one place where two parties have to come together, diametrically opposed, and must come together in an agreement. It's part of the reason that we don't have any agreement in Washington. Nobody knows how to do it anymore. There's no ability to do that anymore. So I'll just close by saying that this is still a crisis. Our government, our Congress, was willing to approve bills with trillions and trillions of dollars of investment in regular people. Now, the programs that they put in place didn't all work, as well as the Workers' First plan that we got for aviation. It was the only industry not to grow in inequality during that time, because we put those controls on the executives, on the corporations, and we invested in the people on the ground. And so I just would really encourage all of you to, first of all, reject any of this narrative about people voting against themselves, because it's not true. They've not been given a fair shake. They have only seen the system be rigged more and more against them. It doesn't work at all. It doesn't create any equality, that's for sure. Women and people of color are going to experience worse and worse conditions if we don't have simple solutions that simply provide people with essentially what FDR was calling for in the Economic Bill of Rights. A decent home, a job with a living wage, health care, protection in the event of disability or old age, and an education without a death sentence. And so we've got to be talking about these very, very simple solutions that people can understand and understand are for them, building the economy from the ground up, rather than continuing to talk about tax breaks that no one in poverty or in lower income can even comprehend, because they don't have the money in the first place to pay those damn taxes. It's very expensive to be poor. So I encourage all of you, as you go out of this room, to reject the notion that people are voting against themselves, and to think about how we put forward bold policies, simple policies, simple solutions, in a moment when we still have a crisis. We have a crisis not just of the existential threat of fascism. We have a crisis of a burning earth. And we have an economy to build up that can work for everyone. We can call people with the urgency of that crisis to build up in a way that makes sense to people, is simple, and doesn't have us fixing policies that are already broken. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara and Senator Brown. It's great to have you with us. I'd like to now invite Alex back up to the stage, as well as Jacob Hacker, for a fireside chat that Sara will be part of as well. And since you haven't met Jacob yet, Jacob Hacker is Professor of Political Science, co-director of the Ludwig Program in Public Sector Leadership at Yale Law School, and director of the American Political Economy Exchange at the Institution for Social and Policy Studies at Yale University. A regular policy advisor and expert commentator, Professor Hacker is known for his writings on health policy, especially his development of the so-called public option.
Does this work? Perfect. And thank you again, Sara, for the great framing remarks and how these issues have been refracted through your union, the industry that you've seen up close for so many years. And thank you, Jacob, for your great essay with Paul, which I encourage people to check out with Paul Pearson. And I'm excited for this conversation about some of the core issues that we're tackling in this project. So maybe starting with you first, Jacob, we've been talking about right-wing populism. That's been the impetus for this project. How would you define right-wing populism, and why should we care about its spread in the United States and around the world?
Thanks, Alex. And so first, let me say I believe in Sherrod Brown's rule that one should never speak after Sara Nelson. So that, and second, I'm glad that we don't actually have a fire here. So I was a little worried about that. And I also want to just acknowledge that most of what I say is coming from my collaborative work with my longtime co-author and friend, Paul Pearson. So obviously, we know that right-wing populism is a global phenomenon, and it's also very much something that has been sweeping advanced industrial democracies. And it's linked up with the rise of the knowledge economy, changing social norms and diversity in these countries. And it's had these common elements that we now all know. It's anti-system. It is often driven by cultural or racial or anti-immigrant backlash. And it's, in most rich democracies, also welfare chauvinist, right? The idea of helping, the sons of the soil, the people who are the real citizens of this country, not those who are trying to appropriate their fair share. And it's clearly linked to the kind of trends that Sara talked about. But I do think it's worth noting that American right-wing populism, which has essentially become the Republican Party, or vice versa, is pretty distinctive in two respects. One is that we have a political system that makes two parties, and only two parties, the norm, and it also is a system that creates very significant advantages, electoral advantages, for the party of non-metro America. Right? And since the non-metro divide is a huge divide in knowledge economies and a big one in the United States, that, as Suzanne Mettler has written about, really has advantaged the Republican Party and driven its radicalization. The second thing is a phenomenon that Paul Pearson and I call plutocratic populism, namely the extent to which American right-wing populism has been very closely linked to this massive rise in inequality, particularly the pulling away of the super rich. And I sometimes think we should be renaming it oligarchic populism in the current context. But I think that both these things make American right-wing populism much more dangerous for democracy. One is that the first can make it a minority pressures that can take over a mainstream party and then win elections despite not having strong popular majoritarian support. And the second is sort of this power of the economic elite supercharges American right-wing populism and drives it towards more unpopular policies that in turn call on the party to pursue even more anti-system ideas.
Great, thanks, Jacob. And I think a helpful perspective on how thinking about the comparative dimensions of populism are really important, but also as they're refracted through our political institutions that change its character in the US. So second question for both of you, maybe starting with you, Sara. The core proposition of this project is that economic policy should focus on democracy, not just on economic outcomes. What would it look like to pursue an economic policy agenda for the working class that would focus on democracy?
Thank you. Sharing is caring. Alex, thank you very much. So first of all, it's really important that people have the opportunity to practice democracy. I hear a lot right now about concern about the breakdown of rule of law. And if you think about it, that rule of law doesn't really ring true with working people. They see the exploitation that led to the Great Recession and the people who did not go to jail. And then they see that the system is very unfair for them. But in their union halls, it's the one place where they get the opportunity to come together. And it is the last non-self-selecting place in America. The boss chooses who is in the work group, who is in the union, not the union members themselves. They have to figure out how to get along. And so in order to get along and in order to have a set of demands that they are collectively bargaining over, they have to hear each other out, hear each other's issues. And that can be a whole range of ages and genders and backgrounds and religions or none and identifications. And there may be different issues in the workplace because of those things, but they've got to hear each other out and come to at first an agreement about what those common demands are going to be. Because in order to back up those demands at the bargaining table, they also have to be ready to say what they're willing to do if they don't get them. Which means that in our case, that's really the threat of a strike. And in order to have a real threat of a strike, you have to have over 90% of the workforce engaged in that. I mean, imagine if we had to deal with any issue in this country and we had to get 90% support in order to get it achieved. It doesn't happen. So people are forced to come together and have a democratic process just to decide those demands first, and then have a process where they're fighting for that together. And then they are voting on that agreement at the end of the day and living with it and understanding that even if they vote against it, if the majority votes for it, that's the way you're going to move forward. So the best chance that people have to participate in democracy that they can really experience and understand the value of that democracy is in a union hall. This is why it's so important that we are making it more possible for workers to join unions. And I would just say that in this moment, Elon Musk thinks that he is going to get away with squashing unions altogether by getting rid of the NLRB. Well, it was 1934, before we had the Wagner Act, that we had general strikes all over this country and incredible instability. And what that did was it brought actually the bosses to the table too to say, we want labor law. That labor law is written more for the stability of the businesses than it was even for the workers. But it created the kind of power that was necessary in order for FDR to put through the New Deal. And all of the things in the social contract that we think of in this country, if you are participating in the economy with that work, that you're gonna have the ability to have a secure life and a secure retirement. So this is, we've got to support unions, but what I would say even more so is that this is a moment where we can't just think about this. I think a lot of times people think of unions as sort of special interest groups, especially since we've shrunk to such a low number. And people also think of it as the union presidents that they interface with here in Washington. But really what it is look at that polling. Look at the polling of 70% of Americans who support unions. They support unions because they see that unions have gotten results when voting, in their view, has not. And those results have come relatively quickly. Now, I'll tell you, the unions would tell you a different story about all the work that went behind those results. But they're seeing that brings results. So we need to be speaking to the 70% of people who want a union and can actually practice that in their workplace. And some of them are already practicing this today without even having a contract. Starbucks workers, for example, getting changes in their workplaces by acting like a union and getting those results. And originally, before labor law was in place, there was recognition and a contract that came when workers would rise up and come together. So in this moment of urgency, that is something that we can encourage from the working class, is that the power actually resides there. And if people come together and act like a union today, and we spread that idea of solidarity, we can actually turn the idea of power on its head. Because Elon Musk has money and control, but he does not have any power. His rocket does not take off without the engineers or the people who are going to put it in place, or the flight attendants who are calling us for representation, serving lunch. And so it is really, really important that we are lifting up the idea of unions and working people working together and cutting through those divisive tactics that would keep us from experiencing that democracy.
That's great. And so I really appreciate you putting the focus on the how economic policy is made through worker power, worker organization, just as much as what that policy agenda looks like. Curious your thoughts on this, Jacob.
Yeah, I mean, I would say two things. One is I really want to echo what Sara said about the importance of unions. If you look across the world, unions have been a critical part of the civil society defense of democracy. And more broadly, I think we should be thinking very seriously about how policies are encouraging greater democratic strength of democratic citizenship and civic organization. I think the essay that you and Shana wrote to introduce this set of essays was really astute on this question. And so, you know, building on the work that you've done, that Paul has done, I think we need much more serious thinking about how public policies themselves can help improve the quality of democratic citizenship, can create the kinds of dignitary effects that we've been talking about. And I completely agree with Sara, to do it in a way that is simple, traceable, transparent, understandable. And, you know, we have to recognize that there's some real failures in public policy and government capacity that lie behind why policy has not done that. So yeah, I think this is a very important agenda, and I can talk a little bit more about the policy priorities in a moment.
That's great. So staying on the theme of the labor movement, you know, Sara, as a labor leader and organizer, could you share a bit of your thinking of how unions can help defang and diffuse the appeal of right-wing populism amongst their members?
Yes. So this part of the problem that we have is the control over the messaging throughout our society. There's incredible control over the kind of narrative that's being set. And, you know, I think about also like the villains in the election. We were vilifying Black men who voted 80% for Harris. But we were vilifying them for like moving away from it. It's turned on its head. It's total BS. So we need to be able to recognize that unions are a place where people are more likely going to trust the information that they're getting because they're getting it from people that they know. This is a place where we can have those conversations. And my experience as a union leader is that when people have good information, they make good decisions. It's when we are giving them bad information that they don't. On this reconciliation package is terrible, terrible, okay? This is not about the deficit. Nobody gives actually it is actually money that is in the private sector. Where did Elon Musk get his money? From our government. That's our money. So the rich have too much money. They have taken too much, but we can actually talk about the policies. We should be attacking this Republican budget that is going to do away with Medicare. I have members in our union who are going to be devastated by this. Members whose parents need extra attention because of Medicaid. Or the people who are going to have to drive 2 and 3 and 5 hours to get to a hospital because hospitals are going to close if we don't have this? Why are we not talking about the actual issues that relate to people as opposed to this fictitious deficit that is hanging over our head, which is actual baloney? Because we all know that that deficit is actually a surplus for the private sector. And so why are we not making sure that that surplus is going to the ground up class so that they don't have to work 2 and 3 jobs to survive, so that they have time to participate in the democracy? This is a huge part of democracy. They don't have time to do it, and they don't believe in it because it hasn't been working for them, and no one has been speaking to their issues. The last thing I'll just say is that when Andy Beshear won in 2018, Reverend Barber had gone to Macomb County and had asked a guy with the last name McCoy, he was the real McCoy, why that county voted 80% for Trump in the last election. And he said, we know Trump is shit, but he came here. And then he came back. And then he sent his staff here. And we haven't seen a Democrat since LBJ. So we're going to talk to the person who's at least talking to us and talking to our issues.
That's powerful. Jacob, did you want to get in on this point, or?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to talk a little bit about the arguments that Paul and I make in the piece about how we should be thinking about the place of policy in this larger critique. And I should say, I think it's really important that we recognize that there has been both this huge shift over time in economic well-being, something that John Cohen will talk about. We have this new measure, the core score, that looks at county level well-being, and it's a much better measure than the ones that Sherrod Brown was critiquing. And there's just we really cannot shy away from the fact that policy has failed in multiple areas to deal with the real strains that Americans are facing. I do think we should recognize that, this particular economic juncture, that politically economic juncture that Democrats faced in the 2024 election was a very difficult context. Okay, the liberals, which is a conservative party in Japan, and conservatives in the UK are all losing office. Not a single incumbent party gained vote share. The first time that's happened since we've been not to absolve the Democrats for some of the many personal changes, long-term as well as short-term missteps, seriously, about structural reasons why the party and progressive ideas have had such a difficult time. And so one thing that we try to emphasize is that there have been real challenges of implementation in progressive policy, and that those were on stark display during the Biden presidency. And we talked a lot about deliverism during this period, but deliverism can't work if you don't actually deliver in time for it to make a difference in elections. And Paul and I talk about how we need to pay much more attention to whether policies are understandable, are visible, are traceable, whether they reinforce, as Sherrod Brown discussed so eloquently, a sense of dignity and status tied to citizenship, as well as provide benefits, and whether they, and this is, I think, the most important neglected point, whether they activate organized supporters, not just whether or not they might cause a voter to change their view in advance of an election. And so part of this is going to be about messaging and mastery of a really, really transformed media world. And I don't know how to do that. That is above my political science pay grade. But I do think that's part of it. But part of it is recognizing how to build power through policy better. And we should recognize that in such a tight electoral context, even marginal effects can be quite substantial, especially as they accumulate. And this is something, unlike a lot of the things that affect whether a government rises or falls, that policymakers have control over. So I think call to action here is that and affect governance and outcomes through their effects on organized groups and other political actors.
Thanks, Jacob. And Suzanne Mettler is with us today, who's also been one of the leading researchers in this area, and we're excited to hear from her in a moment. But before we turn things over to the audience for a couple quick questions, if we have time, would love to hear from you, Sara, on any calls to action that you might have, thinking about the folks in this room, journalists, policymakers, policy thinkers.
Yes. Okay. So in order to solve a problem, you have to define it. It is really important that the people in this room are defining it and defining the real problems, not the fake ones, the real problems. And then we do need to set demands. And we need to be very clear about what it is that then we need to back that up with what we're willing to do. So the other thing that I would just say to all of you is take a moment to actually get out on a picket line and stand out there with striking workers and hear their stories, and bring your friends and neighbors with you too. Go to a Tesla takedown event and spread the word that it's time for everyone to bring clarity, because the last component to solving problems is adding urgency. One thing to say is that, I'm out there calling for a general strike for it as people are being disappeared off the street because they wrote an op-ed in opposition to what our government's doing. And so we need to really be spreading the message that working people can take control and getting back to those principles and sharing that. A lot more agreement out there. When I uttered general strike during the shutdown, I was getting letters from the airline saying, "You can't do that." No one is sending me letters today. People instability in this moment that we're in. And they're saying it quietly in the boardrooms, but it's happening. And so we just have to act with a lot more urgency ourselves to get results.
That's great. I appreciate you putting this moment into the larger context of, where we fit in and social, political, economic instability.
As we're talking with people who are in the business world, the other benefit of having unions on the property is that when workers are bargaining, they get to understand the context of that bargaining. How much money is there for them to get? What is their fair share? And typically, workers then understand the business better too. And that is a benefit to the people running the company. I mean, unless they're trying to pull the wool over everybody's eyes and send it all to Wall Street in stock buybacks. But it makes for a better business when you have everyone engaged and you have everyone feeling like they can take part in it because they are respected enough to have a contract for that work.
Yeah, that is a great point. Well, I'm looking to Melissa to see if we have time for 1 to 2 questions. And it's such a great group of people in this room, so I'm hoping that we can get a couple voices and questions from the collective brilliance in here. Chirag, if you could introduce yourself and keep your question brief so we can get to a couple.
Okay, hello, my name is Chirag Baines. I'm at Brookings and Democracy Fund, was in the Obama and Biden administrations. Sara, I was really struck by your comments that were both about economic populism and fighting for working people, and also about gender and racial justice. And this is a moment in which there's real retrenchment around civil rights and race, and there's an argument, including on the left, that we just shouldn't talk about these things, gender, race, sexuality, sexual orientation, because they are divisive, right? We will lose parts of our coalition. And there's even an argument about we just need to deliver more, to Jacob's point, or deliverism, that sort of thing. And we should put some of our regulatory concerns around the environment, around civil rights and equity to the side, make those lesser priorities, And there's a bit of this that's in your rising tide metaphor, Sarah. So I just wonder, sitting where you sit, all of you, but particularly Sarah, I'm interested in your thoughts here. How are you thinking about this in terms of the policy agenda, and how are you talking about these issues? To what extent are you still talking about? You talked about it here, I know, but with in the union world and with workers, and what do you prescribe for us?
That's great. Actually, could we collect one more or two more? Here.
My name is Gus. I'm a recent graduate of Cornell's Global Development Master's Program, so great time to be going into that field. Thank you all. That was a great presentation. My question is sort of calling back to what Sherrod said about people craving dignity and purpose. And on the other hand, the necessity of real economic Bill of Rights. How do you square those two things in policy, and how do you square those two things politically?
That's great. And maybe one more, and then we'll turn it over to the panel.
Thank you so much for this. My name is Thea. I run a nonprofit called the Futures Institute. And my question would be for all of you, but probably particularly for Sarah. Thinking about the desired future of labor policy, just in the sense that we do need to have resurgence of solidarity amongst the working class. Clearly, unions are a big part of that. But as you noted, the National Labor Relations Act was not really written to actually help unions be all that they could future we want. Are there a few specific changes that you would imagine making to the NLRA, or just a different framework that might do a better job of getting the kind of strong labor sector we want?
Great, thank you so much. So future of labor policy, how to make economic dignity real, and how do we think about these competing narratives around gender and racial justice and economic justice at the same time? So easy questions for our final wrap up.
If you go into any room anywhere, people will one of the first questions they'll ask is, what do you do? People are very much tied to their jobs. The idea that we would actually run an economy where we would presume that 5% of the economy of the workforce is out of work at any time in order to keep inflation down. Like in my shoes about people's own identities. And it's tied to dignity of work is tied directly to what are the safety policies in that workplace? Do workers have a voice in that workplace? Are workers making enough money in that workplace? Because one of the reasons there is that dignity in work, I think about the United Mine Workers of America. I think about those miners who, mining is a terrible job. It's horrible. It'll break down your body. You're subject to black lung. There's all kinds of horrible things, but miners take incredible pride in the work that they do. That's because through their union, they built up good jobs where they could actually take care of their families and feel pride in that. And that's what people, really want. In terms of, how do we address this issue that because there's been an attack on social issues and on identity issues, that we shouldn't be talking about that, is I think that what that means is that white men are still defining the narrative that we should have. So let's recognize that first. Okay. But secondly, if I'm a union leader and I want to go out and we're all in jeopardy of being mistreated. And it wasn't until our union, I think I have the benefit of being mentored by women. I have the benefit of being in a union that has always been sort of dismissed and disregarded. And so we had to be very creative about the way that we were getting results. But I heard, recently that we were the white girls union. And we set about an effort to really work on diversity and inclusion in our union and to make union pins that would identify people's heritage. And all of a sudden, the people who started the rainbow of people in our union. And so it is really important, if we're going to actually change things, we have to do that together. Dr. King, a lot of people like to talk about the 1963 Dr. King, as Eddie Glaude would say, but we should talk about the 1968 Dr. King, who was talking about dignity of work. And he was talking about safety, and he was talking about social justice being directly tied to economic justice. And he was also talking about peace and taking on war. And he was very I've seen The Promised Land, and I may not get there with you. But we as a people will get there. And if we are not rejecting these calls for us to stop talking about people are having. We be ill about that. Like, we have not done enough to actually create the coalition that can win, because we have not given voice and leadership and space to all of the people who have been marginalized, felt bias in their lives, felt disregarded, and had to be very creative. These are the people who are going to come with the solutions. And these are the people who are going to empower our economy and our politics in a way that is going to allow us to take on the challenges of tomorrow.
That was so well said. And I wonder if, Jacob, you wouldn't mind, because I think we're hitting up against time, if you want to take a yes, a lightning round.
Amen.
So please join me in a hearty round of applause for our fantastic panel. And I think we've discovered the secret to following a Sara Nelson speech, which is to have her on your panel.